as a former public servant and having listened there to some of the comments and all the hassle that's going on at the moment, I'm still proud to have been a public servant, and I've always, my own departments that I've tended to work in latter years have been at the interface between the public service and the private sector, the sense of the various sectors, and we've had responsibility for a lot of the commercial state companies. So we would have seen at very close hand a lot of the changes, not least Aer Lingus post 9/11. Peter's own union got very involved, and the dramatic change that took place there within about 6 months. So I'll work away myself on this, I think, will I? Sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. What I want to do, I've a number of slides, and if I can just go through them, but I'll go through them fairly quickly, because what I want to do is go back over some of the issues that have, the reforms that have happened. Some of you may be familiar with them. I'll just flag some of them and maybe talk on the summary that the experience over the last, particularly the last 15 years, and then talk a little about the next stage of where we're going to. Colm has set the scene for that, and I comment on some of that later as well. And I suppose people's view of the public service, and particularly the civil service, and maybe if I pull the mic up. A bit of an all-rounder here today. It was the Department of Communications anyway. Most people's view of the civil service is very much the Sir Humphrey, and Sir Humphrey, I don't know if you can read that down there, but so I'm going to refer every so often to the Yes Minister series, because there was a lot of truisms in what they said, and Alan Dukes, and I see Ray McSherry down here as well, will be very familiar. I remember a former minister arriving in on one occasion, and the first thing he asked for was a set of the Yes Minister series. So he found them very helpful. If you go way back to the early 30s, and with the Brennan Commission, and they thought that the public service at the time was satisfactory. Devlin report in '69, where the effort was at splitting what was called the ARACT, or the policy making, from the agencies, and I suppose the start of agencies coming out of that. And again, the Department of Public Service itself was established subsequently to that. And then John Boland's 1985, Delivering Better Government, really about managerialism and that whole side of it. But interestingly enough, never debated in the Dáil Seanad. And there were a number of initiatives in the late 80s then. The DPS was amalgamated back into the Department of Finance, Efficiency Audit Group, the introduction of performance pay, and for civil servants what were called the administrative budgets that allowed you to look 3 years ahead and do a deal with the Department of Finance on how much you were going to get. I suppose that's going back over up to the last 15 years ago, and in the last 15 years there's been a plethora of initiatives, a huge number, starting in 93, 94 with the Strategic Management Initiative. And that came about from 11 of us were involved at the time in the first Assistant Secretary group doing a Master's in Public Service Management. And we came up with this concept and met Albert Reynolds, and he thought it was great, in fairness, took it on board. And coming out of that then, 2 years later, was the Delivering Better Government, and a consequent one, or subsequent one, for local government. There were a huge range of specific initiatives. I'm not going to go through them all, but just want to give you a flavour for the type of things. Customer service was a big one, particularly for the politicians. I mean, they were getting it in the neck, and rightly so. People saying, we're not getting this, we're not being treated like customers. A whole series of things then about public expenditure review. Colm would probably say, if he was marking them as an essay in college, would say we probably failed on some of those. Introduction to the Public Service Management Act, which gave a legal basis for a lot of the changes to split the role of the Secretary of the Department. Secretary is then responsible, or Secretary General responsible for the management of the Department, and the Minister responsible for the political issues. Now, people might say, you know, that's how significant is that? But it is really significant, and one of the issues that people may not be aware of, most heads of department, sorry, every head of department, but many agencies as well, have two functions. As the head of the department, your head, in this case, the Secretary General, you're in charge of all the management, and ministers don't interfere in the management, and the political process doesn't interfere. But your job is to deliver statements of strategy and so on, and deliver the policy advice. But as what's known as the accounting officer, going back to the old 1850s, you're directly responsible to Parliament for the way money is spent through the Public Accounts Committee. So any of the insomniacs that sit on a Thursday night watching the Public Accounts Committee will see that every week some member, some public official is grilled, and this is the part of that process. Freedom of Information Act introduced in '97, and subsequently decimated, probably, in the main, some people would say. And then other legislation. So a sort of a series of initiatives saying that the customers, some of the putting in place a proper framework, and then this issue of the compellability of witnesses and so on, bringing people before Oireachtas committees. Again, a deficiency in that, I think, and I think we've seen that in more recent years as well. The idea then of introducing multi-annual budgets, and again for the nerds in our group, for the accountants, government operates on a cash-based accounting system. Personally, I think it's a disaster. I think what it doesn't do is take the accruals that are into the future. Pensions, for instance, aren't factored in. So you have a situation that if you were running a sweet shop, you'd have to have a set of accounts that take on board the depreciation of your own assets. Government doesn't do that. And so now you see some of the problems. We ran a set of accounts in the 90s for 3 consecutive years where we did a set of accrual accounts and cash accounts. And at the time we provided for pensions at the rate of 23% onto the normal salaries. Those figures today, I think if Colm talked to his colleagues on the actuarial side, would probably be closer to 50%. And so then, late 90s and going into 2000, the introduction of the performance management development. Again, very much issues taken from international, what was going on across the system worldwide, introducing some of the managerial concepts into the civil and public service, starting generally with the civil service and moving outwards, code of standards, code of behaviour and so on. The idea of statements of strategy then, that within 6 months after a new government coming in, every department has to issue a statement of strategy, signed off by the minister about what they're going to achieve. It's a 3-year strategy. I'm sure everyone reads them. I mean, they're gripping reads, and I can see it already just looking down there that you're all familiar, you've all done this. Benchmarking report, and maybe come back to that later because it's an issue that comes up all the time now in the media, the 2002 benchmarking. And then the decentralisation plans for 10,000 civil servants. There's obviously someone doesn't want decentralisation. I think one of the issues that there's a very strict cabinet procedures issue that documents are circulated in advance to all departments, they're given time to come. And government then, people mightn't believe this, but then all the comments are put down and the government make a decision based on that. Interestingly, decentralisation was never circulated in advance, so you didn't have that debate. And personally, I think that when governments bypass the process, you end up with very bad decision-making. There's a process there that has stood us in good stead for many years. My view, very much, is stick to it. You mightn't like the results, but stick to it for a very good reason. There were a number of reviews of Strategic Management Initiative and Delivering Better Government. There was an independent evaluation done. It said it's a more effective organisation. The programme is far from complete. But deeper engagement by the politicians is critical. And to be honest, the Strategic Management Initiative had very little political engagement. It was driven by civil servants themselves in an effort to take ownership of our own future. In other words, not to wait for someone outside. The CNAG, Controller and Auditor General, again gave a report in 2007 and talked about, about the lack of, I suppose, coordination. Many of the issues we deal with today in government, they're not just economic issues, I think everyone accepts that, but they're not within your own gift either. If you're dealing with the climate change issue, you have half the government involved in it. If you're dealing with children, for instance, you have health, you have education, you have social welfare. So the challenge today is to get different agencies, different government departments working together with a specific solution in mind. Unfortunately, departments and organisations and individuals often go in on the basis of how can I mitigate my own whatever I have to do as a result of this meeting. So there's a challenge in that. Quality assurance then, setting up of quality assurance, customer service, a new act on recruitment, and that again allowing individual departments to recruit people, not that there'll be much recruitment I think now, a new standard of codes of behaviour and new civil service regulations to allow for dismissal of staff and the like. Previously what you had to do was a civil servant couldn't be dismissed without it going to government. And the issue was discussed and had to be discussed at government. I'm not saying none of us are in the business of wanting to dismiss people, but there comes a time in every organisation when tough decisions have to be made. So that facility has been made much more, I think, sensible in fairness. 2006, the government decided to do the OECD report that Peter's talked about, and I'll come back to that in a second. A number of organisational checks, as they call them, looking at different departments, and again starting with the big ones, starting with the health and so on like that. And then I suppose the government were keen to get new systems for reporting to government on how departments are doing. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute, and I'll just be interested to get your comments on it. And a final one on that, I suppose, is the idea of leadership. I mean, organisations don't change things. It's people who change things ultimately, and it's about leadership and creating a cadre of leaders and supporting them. And one of the comments I'd have here, again, for the politicians in our midst, is that this culture that has grown in recent times of a blame culture on everything, allowing no risk-taking. And so we're not going to get out of the situation we're in without taking risks. And again, I plead with people to think about taking risks means that sometimes you get it wrong. So we have to be willing as a country to do that, and measuring performance. Go back to Peter McClune has talked about the main conclusions. I won't go over them. To talk about the relative low number of public servants. It's on track in public sector reform and so on. I think when you look at globalisation today, the paradox of globalisation for me is if something can be done anywhere in the world, it's the local issue that makes it important, the local quality of life, the local sort of economic situation, the cost of the cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is locally. It's also the quality of the public service becomes a key issue. A lot of the companies we deal with in this country, Jim O'Hara was here from Intel last night, have a system that they apply across the world. And what we need to do to distinguish ourselves is a good quality public service. I'm not talking about bloated or whatever now, but I'm just talking about the quality of advice and the quality of service delivery. Government at the time set up a number of bodies then, and columnists talked about them. Sorry, I'll just go back on that one. Those documents are all available, and I'm not sure actually that many of you have read them on the website, but they are there, and they're actually, you know, if people are going to debate some of these issues, I'd honestly suggest them that's worth looking at some of these. There's a number of other reviews going to come up over the next number of years, and again on this is part of the day-to-day work that goes on. The problem I find with it is that most people never read the reports, and in the sense that even the Oireachtas committees don't read them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through them now, I just want to flag them. Procurement is one issue I do want to say. There's a huge issue there. The public service spends an awful lot of money in this country. And to help smaller Irish companies, a lot of the time we have to be willing to stretch out. And if you've got to take the risks there as well, the sense that allow small operations, small companies compete. If we make it so difficult for them, they won't be able to compete. They'll never get started. They go and try and sell abroad and they're told, well, are you selling in Ireland? And they'll say, no, we can't get business in Ireland. So there's an issue here about procurement. My commentaries on this experience of reform so far, up to 1985, I'd say very limited reform. 85 to 94, slow build-up, again limited reform. 94 to 2005, some of the changes were in line with international trends. In my view, though, we weren't anything like being radical enough. I think one of the issues, and it's the issue that we need consensus on everything, means that things take time. And the problem with taking time, when you take the backdrop of what Colm is talking about, 400 million a week, that's 2.5 million every hour as we sit here, is being borrowed. 35,000 young people coming out of college in the next number of weeks are coming out at the moment. Not too many jobs lined up for them. So the question of time is important. Room for much more external inputs and overviews. And I think we're very unclear today what the role of the state in a modern economy is. If I asked you 5 years ago and told you that the state would be owning banks in America and owning General Motors and everything, you'd have laughed me off the stage. But actually, the role of the state today, the state and a lot of the things the state did was able to take a long-term perspective, take a long-term rate on return, and had the capital to do it. So there's an issue there, and I'd be very much about it. I'm a market-driven person, but I think we need to look at that. And honestly, I think there's a need for reform of the political process. I heard a speech recently where one of the politicians was telling us that there's a major reform coming in September, and when the Dáil comes back, they're starting at 30 minutes earlier on a Tuesday, from 2:30 to 2 o'clock. I don't want to sound cynical, but the reaction when that was said at a lecture was laughter. I suppose when you're looking at any reform in any organisation, particularly public, we've got to make the case for change. We've got to articulate that vision, and then we have a number of initiatives. I mean, it's classic stuff, but it is putting in place then the organisation structure. And I really think, we've heard this morning a major debate about the role of external directors, non-executive directors. There is a need, I think, for experienced outsiders here who have experience of driving major change. When you look at the composition of the Dáil today, you find very little managers or business people who have experience of driving major change in major organisations. And I think we should use them, whether by bringing them into the Senate or whether by bringing them on in other ways. But I think we do need to tap into that experience and expertise that's out there. And I really think the sense of urgency. I mean, when I hear people talking that we're going to have another committee to look at another report, and as I said, we're borrowing 2.5 million every hour, I say, you know, really, my view, for what it's worth, is I would take column. Show of hands now. If you were marking those, would you say delivered or not delivered? All those who think they were delivered last year, just put your hand up. Not delivered. And a whole lot in between. Well, you'll be glad to know that the Department of Finance on each of these has delivered, right? And the reason is that it's the provision of advice is the issue. This isn't about the deliverables, it's the provision of advice. So I slagged the Department of Finance on this and saying, like, we have these amazing documents, but let's get the metrics right in them. Because if it's about the provision of advice is one thing, but the deliverables, I don't think anybody here would say that we've delivered on the other side. So what are the choices? We can continue with the old model that we have. And to be honest, I mean, there is an issue about failure to deliver expectations. There is a weakening in public service values, and we have been very lucky in this country over the years, I think, on public service values. The increasing cost, we can see that from Cullum's report. Many demoralised and frustrated staff, and one of the issues where the frustration comes is watching some people not performing and that work shifting to good performers. That's very, very demoralising for people. We don't have a culture of management in the public service. We have a culture of administration, but not real management, and that's the thing we've been working on, I suppose. And then some of the leadership failures. Looking at an option then, I mean, we can continue with that, or we can look at a much more innovative. We've got to position ourselves as best in class internationally. We're a global economy, we talk about that so many times, and the only way we can do that is compete against the best in class. People have got to be proud of working in the public service. We want good people to work in it, and we want them to be proud of it. And then we have to have that whole management, and I would say leadership renewal that's needed. So some comments on the 2006-2008 document, Transforming Public Services. It is a good document, there's a lot in it. But I think it's very important. A report is not a result, and I say that about Cullum's report as well. Sometimes we think, there's hundreds of reports I read there recently in the health service, sitting there, and we do a report on a report. So the report itself is not a result. And sometimes you can't put old wine or new wine into old wineskins. Estate known as the permanent secretary. Wooly here is your principal private secretary. I too have a principal private secretary, and he's the principal private secretary to the permanent secretary. Directly responsible to me are 10 deputy secretaries, 87 under secretaries, and 219 assistant secretaries. Directly responsible to the principal private secretary are plain private secretaries, and the Prime Minister will be appointing a parliamentary under secretaries, and you'll be appointing your own parliamentary private secretary. Do they all type? So there is an issue. I think a serious issue is, you know, we do need, in my view, for a 5-year period, a Minister for Public Sector Reform, because this won't be done or driven unless someone is given responsibility at Cabinet to do it. And I think one of the things is they deal with the overarching. Public sector reform is an overarching issue, covers every department and agency, and I think you need a full ministry with a minister and the backing of the Taoiseach and the Minister for Finance. I don't think it can happen within the current institutions, and you take out some of the functions that finance have at the moment and put them into this. In conclusion, if I can, there have been some very significant changes over the last decade, 15 years in particular, but I think we need to be more radical and more challenging in our approach. I think the scope and depth of the changes and the urgency just cannot, if I was to emphasise any one thing this week, it's about urgency. You know, we publish Cullum's report and then we talk about other reports. We're talking about this all being dealt with in the budget in December. That's 20 weeks. That's 8 billion more will have been borrowed by the time we do that. My view, a lot of this could be done immediately. Let's hold back maybe on the social welfare if that's the difficult one until January, but let's start on the other ones immediately, and let's not let this thing accumulate. And if you were running your own business, that's what you do, you know. You certainly wouldn't be going off on holidays for 8 weeks, and I think that, you know, if you're borrowing that amount of money, 2.5 million every hour, you wouldn't be going on holidays. You'd actually come in and you'd... Fine. I'm going to politics after this. Finally, I think we dealt with Northern Ireland and some other issues in a very interesting way. We got cross-party consensus. In my view, some of the issues on public sector reform are so important for the long-term future of the state that we actually could do with some consensus and just get on with it, but it doesn't change every week or every month with any change of government. This is one that, look, if you want your kids to be working in this country and want them to have good jobs and you want your own pensions in the future, we've got to take the action now. Not in 6 months' time, not in 12 months' time. Do it now. That's my final conclusion. Thanks very much.